I have a few, two or three important announcements. Firstly, the delegates from India who are promised the reimbursement, please visit the finance team tomorrow, the finance desk. There's a form you have to fill. You have been emailed a link to that Google form. In case you don't have it, there is a QR code that you can use to access that link. Also, just to reiterate, we have some of the most beautiful lantana elephants put up outside. During the poster sessions and the Who's Who session, please go visit them. There are opportunities to share your stories on coexistence. So please do that. Also, there we have a wonderful bookstore, our very own small bookstore of Champaka, which is where the posters start. And there's a range of books for all ages and all genres put up over there. Please visit that. All right. So with that announcement, we can begin with our next session. We have an exciting plenary, and we have the privilege of listening to Pradip Krishen. He is joining us online, unfortunately, but he will be sharing his learnings on restoration ecology. It promises to be a truly inspiring presentation, and to introduce him and to tell us more about, please join me in welcoming Nirupa Rao. Thanks, Nirupa.
Good evening, everyone. As most of us know, Pradip Krishen is an environmentalist and filmmaker known for his work in ecological restoration and conservation of native flora. He's also very much appreciated for authoring several field guides, including The Trees of Delhi and Jungle Trees of Central India, which have helped the general public identify and fall back in love with Indian trees. Today, he'll speak about his work with various restoration projects across the country, including the Kishan Bagh Sand Dune Park in Jaipur and the Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park in Jodhpur. How he started off as a passionate novice in the field and through trial, error, and curiosity brought his learnings to life. I recently had the honor of mentoring a botanical art workshop at the Rao Jodha Park because I'm a botanical illustrator. And this workshop was initiated by Pradip, and he continues to oversee it every year. So through long sunrise walks, field trips to neighboring areas, and hours spent together as a group, I, of course, observed firsthand the energy and passion for which he is very well known. But beyond this, I was struck most of all by how much Pradip loves stories. He sees a landscape through its geological journey and the interactions and behaviors of its inhabitants, and he loves to present them in a way that truly captures the imagination. As only true storytellers really are, he is utterly generous with his knowledge. And so, even if we can't have him in person today to speak with us, we are so lucky for this opportunity to learn about restoration from him. And I'm personally very glad to be here. So thank you all for joining us.
Hello, everybody. And thank you, Nirupa, for that very generous introduction. One small correction, I'm not really going to be talking about anything other than Rao Jodha Park. So I'm not talking about Kishan Bagh, but what I really set out to try and do was to try and recollect what it was like to be a novice, to be somebody who had not done any restoration work at all. And to, so I want to talk about the journey as a novice, the mistakes I made, the things I saw, the things I learned. And at the end, I've tried to put together certain learnings that I'll talk about. So some things that you'll find in the, as this presentation unfolds, are all related to things I'm going to see right at the end. It's going to be a bit of a struggle to try and do this all within 1 hour. So if somebody can somehow tap me on the shoulder and let me know when I've crossed, let's say, 45 minutes, it'll help me to wind up in time. But thank you so much for inviting me and for having me here. Some of you will have already been to Jodhpur, but for those of you who don't know where Mehrangarh is, there's a map that shows you where Jodhpur is. And this is the incredible monumental fort of Mehrangarh, towering above the city of Jodhpur, and built on a massive outcrop of volcanic rock. The fort itself is made of sandstone, which was quarried inside, but the sandstone actually sits above a huge outcrop of volcanic rock. Now, I first came here in 2005, having done a little bit of work in a fort that was also managed by the same trust that looks after Mehrangarh. And I was writing my first book on the trees of Delhi. The red is where the fort is, and the area within the yellow line is the land that was intended to be a new park called the Rao Jodha Desert Rock Park. And both these pictures that are on the screen here show you what the park was like when I first saw it in 2005 and what it was still like in 2006, which is when we actually began work. And those of you who are good at spotting trees will probably realize very quickly that almost everything you're seeing in these two pictures consists of Vilaiti kikar or Prosopis juliflora, which is an invasive plant from Mexico and further south, except for this little clump of trees where my pointer is. Is my pointer visible? Is there a way of getting a confirmation? Can you see my pointer? Well, I hope so. All right. So this is what the park was like in 2006. And this gives you a slightly closer view of how densely you had Prosopis juliflora growing pretty much everywhere inside the 70 hectares or so of the area of the park. Now, I have to admit that when I first came here and was shown this land, and I was asked by the CEO of the trust whether I was interested in trying to green this area, I remember very clearly saying to him, look, it depends on what you mean by greening it. Because if you mean making it like a municipal park, with lawns and park benches and, flowering trees of a certain kind, then do you realize that you're going to have to bring in literally millions of tons of soil from elsewhere, because there's virtually no soil here. You're going to have to uproot all the Vilaiti kikar, which is going to happen anyway. And you're also going to have to water every single plant, every single day, for as long as you have the park. And the CEO looked at me and he said, look, when you put it like that, obviously it doesn't make sense to try and make a municipal park, but what is the alternative? And I said, well, the only alternative seems to be to try and recreate as much as we can, as far as we can, a natural habitat, bring in all the plants that grow here that are well adapted to this soil, these particular rocks and this particular soil. And they had no idea what this would mean. And they said, look, we're unsure of what the outcome is going to be. So we'll give you 3 years for you to show us what you can do. And I said, look, in 3 years, we'll hardly be able to show you anything, because 3 years is a very short amount of time, especially in a semi-desert where the growing season is very, very short. But to cut a long story short, they eventually said, all right, we're going to support this project. So when can you begin? And we began this project in April of 2006. I have to admit that when I first saw this land, I thought, wow, look, it's fantastic in terms of its juxtaposition with the fort. It's got a great location, but there's a heck of a lot of work left to do to try and get rid of the Vilaiti kikar, which, by the way, is called Bavlia in Jodhpur. So I'm going to use the word Bavlia because I'm more used to that. So Bavlia was one huge problem. This set of pictures here shows you what the fort was like in the 1920s. I chanced upon this black and white picture. So clearly somewhere between the 1920s and 2006, Vilaiti kikar crept in. We uncovered the story later, where one of the Maharajas in the 1930s was told that, look, would you like to green your desert kingdom? It's completely barren. And if so, there's this magical plant that grows in South America and in Mexico, and the seeds are available in Kew Gardens. And that particular Maharaja used to fly his own airplane. So he ordered bags and bags and bags of seeds of Vilayati Kikar, and he went up in the air and he scattered the seeds of Vilayati Kikar throughout the kingdom of Jodhpur. So this was a legacy of something that the Maharaja had done with every good intention. It wasn't, he was obviously not aware at all at that time of what the results would be. And that's why you have this very big distinction between what the park looked like, or this area looked like in the 1920s, and how it had become completely overrun with Bavlia by 2006. The other daunting aspect of doing any kind of work here was that the rock here was a volcanic rock called rhyolite. Rhyolite is an extrusive volcanic rock that spews out of the caldera of a volcano, immensely hard, as hard as granite, if not harder. And all of the land that the park occupied was filled with this very, very hard rock. This picture on the bottom left is a tourism poster from the 1940s. And you can see how even then they were struck by these flat-faced vertical rocks that made up this part of Jodhpur. So one of the things we had to do was to begin to try and understand rhyolite, what it was, how it came to be here. We came upon this map which showed an area called the Malani Igneous Suite, which is a remnant of something that happened roughly 750 million years ago, long before the Indian subcontinent had docked with Eurasia. So it was still part of the supercontinent when you had the volcanic activity here. And these were remnants of that particular igneous event, 751 million years ago. And now, because subsequently the tar had been covered by a shallow sea, basically all of the volcanic rock had been covered with sand, and then eventually with sandstone. So it only outcrops in particular areas. So we were beginning to get to understand what the rock forms were like. As we got more and more familiar with the desert, we understood that the desert is immensely complex in terms of its geology. And while sandstone and rhyolite and perhaps to a slightly lesser degree calcrete are the most common forms of rocks in the desert, actually the desert is beautifully complex in terms of all the different kinds of rocks you find. And I'll refer to this later when we talk about the learnings. So the first big issue was, how do we cut into rhyolite in order to get rid of the Bavlia in the first place, and then to plant native desert plants? And we received a number of suggestions from local people. We did a little bit of research on the net. Local suggestions ranged from, why don't you use dynamite, to other people saying, why don't you just use fresh gobar on a full moon night, then you cut the Bavlia at the stem, and then within 1 week it's going to disappear. We knew none of this was going to work, but we tried it anyway, stupidly. But what we did discover was that in order to get rid of Bavlia has a rooting zone, a budding zone that travels about 1.5 to 2 feet down the root. So you need to dig down to a minimum of 2 feet in order to disable Bavlia from growing again, from coppicing and regrowing. So the issue was cutting into rhyolite to the extent of a minimum of 2 feet, and perhaps for safety 2.5 to 3 feet. And after some experimentation, somebody said, why don't you use the traditional miners of the Marwar region, which is a community called the Khandwalias. And we met this gentleman whose picture you can see on the bottom left, called Dhan Singh. And we said, Dhan Singh ji, can you show us what you can do in terms of cutting into the rock? Because we'd heard that they're absolutely expert at cutting into rock. We were a little skeptical because the rock that is used most often in Jodhpur tends to be sandstone and not rhyolite. So it's far more common for Khandwalias to be working in sandstone. But they use an extremely heavy hammer, about 4 kilograms in weight, and they use chisels, and that's really all they use. And Dhan Singh, when we showed him a 4-foot-high bush, said, "Ha sahab, this is easy, this is not a problem at all." And we said, look, we want you to show us that you can cut into a depth of at least 2.5 feet. So he sat down on his haunches and he tapped the ground 3 or 4 times lightly with his heavy hammer. And then he averted his face, he turned his face to one side, and he hit the ground hard 3 or 4 times. And we assumed that the reason that he was averting his face was that he didn't want chips of the rock, shards of the rock, to go into his eyes or into his face, or so we thought. But gradually, over time, we realized that the reason why Khandwalias do this, they tap the rock hard in order to understand how the rock is bedded, where it's khali, where it's pola, all the information they need to start cutting into the rock, they gather from these 3 or 4 blows that they make on the rock. So even though we didn't know this, impressive to see the facility with which he was able to cut into the rock. And he started pulling out these ribbon roots, they're 2-dimensional roots, because that's what had happened to the Bavlia roots when they are snaking into thin cracks in the rock. So we eventually hired 15 Khandwalias, gave them floppy cricket hats. We gave them goggles as well to protect their eyes, which didn't last very long. And the floppy hats didn't last very long either. But we eventually ended up by having the Khandwalias work for us for 7 years to clear 70 hectares of Bavlia. So tree by tree, plot by plot, proceeding on an average in an area of about 5 or 6 or 7 hectares every year, they slowly cleared the entire plot of Bavlia. And we were following close behind with our planting. Now, this just gives you some idea of how they're actually cutting in. These are all. So one of the decisions we took very early on, and this decision was actually a completely fortuitous decision. It was not something that came out of deep thought or planning, but it turned out to be an excellent decision. We said that, look, Bavlia has probably shown us exactly where it's possible for a plant to grow in this very, very difficult terrain. So maybe the thing to do is wherever the Khandwalias are cutting into the rock, in order to remove the Bavlia, that very space should become a planting pit to take a new plant. So this is the method that we were using. You can see that some of these pits are actually long pits because they found what they call a bar. A bar is a Marwari word, which means basically a long crack. And that's how they were basically proceeding. And this became the template with which we decided about where we were going to plant. I'm going to refer to this picture later on when we talk about the learnings, but I've included these pictures here because I want you to understand that we slowly began to realize that some of the richest places that we were seeing in the countryside that had rocks were actually cracks. That arrow that is pointing to the crack in the lower picture, we set up as our objective. We wanted to try and rewild. Rewild is a word we use now. We weren't using then, but we wanted to try and restore the hill that you see on top, and use these cracks to do some planting. We'll come to this in a moment. Now, this is not a word I knew then, chasmophytes, but I've come to know it later. But Chasmophytes basically is a word that's used to describe plants that grow in cracks. And wherever we went traveling in the desert, and even in our own site, this is what greets you when especially in the monsoon and the post-monsoon period, when the cracks all come alive with annuals and ephemerals that like to live in cracks. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because what happens in a crack is that, especially in a narrow crack, the soil that goes deep inside is protected from being desiccated from the air and from the sun by the very fact that it's in a crack. So cracks became our friends. We realized that we actually had to use the cracks, and that these were some of the best places in which to start our planting work. The other word, lithophytes, is a word we got hold of very early. We knew that we're looking for plants that have evolved to do well, to be perfectly adapted to growing in a rocky terrain. So everything that we needed to look for, just to remind you, something like 75 to 80% of the Thar Desert is actually sandy. So 75 to 80% of the Thar Desert was not of relevance to the plants we were. All right. Now, the word reference sites is something that has come into our vocabulary a lot later. But, and I'll come back to this when we're talking about our learnings. But everything that we were doing in the beginning, partly by instinct, partly by common sense, was going out and looking for sites that resembled in some way the site that we were working on. What we didn't fully realize in the beginning was that, all rocks are not the same. The picture that you see at the bottom left, for example, is a sandstone set of hills. And sandstone, it so happens that sandstone and rhyolite have very similar elements. They tend to have a lot of iron and a lot of silica. But some of the other rock types and some of the plants that grow in these kind of rocks don't necessarily adapt to being put into a rhyolitic soil. So this is something we had to learn the hard way, by finding that plants weren't actually prospering, even though they were lithophytes and growing in rock. The other thing we tried to do early on was to try and look for historical clues about what grew in this particular habitat. Now, the main picture that you see of the fort on the left is a painting by somebody called Wilder from the end of the 19th century. And what you're seeing are basically generic pictures. I mean, you can recognize the euphorbia, which some people mistake as a cactus with the candelabra look. And you can probably make out calotropis, but everything else tends to be generic. You can't really put an ID on any of those plants. I found that when you look at Mughal miniatures or Rajput miniatures, such as the ones on the right, I also struggle. I mean, sometimes you can make out banana plants and you can make out mangoes and you can make out the kadam, but it's actually quite hard to do any kind of IDing. And after a while, we began to think that the Rajput miniatures weren't really helpful, even though the picture that you see on the top right, you can actually see the pink rhyolite, the volcanic hills that are such a feature of Jodhpur. So they're getting some things right, but they're not getting the plants right. So we started work in April of 2006, as I said. You can see the ground looking like a piece of Swiss cheese. These are all the holes that you see here are holes from which Bavlia has been excavated by cutting down into a depth of about 2.5, sometimes 3 feet. I have a very distinct memory of sitting on this wall that you see on the left, and in that first year thinking, what arrogance on my part to think that I know what to do. Yes, we've taken out the Bavlia, and the Bavlia definitely needs taking out, but do I know enough about how to grow a native plant suite in this habitat? And what is going to happen if I fail? And it was a frightening moment, I must admit. And then I consoled myself with the thought that, look, if nothing works, I will just bring back Bavlia and replant it in all these holes and tell the trust that, look, I'm really sorry, but we failed, but here's your landscape back with you as I first found it. And that was how I consoled myself. I've got a few pictures just to give you a sense of the process. The picture on the top left shows you a part of the park with all the Bavlia intact. And the Bavlia comes right down almost to the edge of the lake. The picture on the right and the picture below that shows you with the Bavlia, the closer Bavlia removed in the first year. Some of it has been burnt in the foreground. And in the lower picture, which looks quite green, it's looking green only because you've got monsoon ephemerals and grasses and cleome making it look green because they've sprung up on their own without any help from us. So even though we actually have done a little bit of planting at this stage in the monsoon of 2006, all our plants are much too small to even be noticeable. So 2006 on the left, still will accept your monsoon ephemerals. 3 years later, you can see where my pointer is that a number of trees have come up, including some fairly large neems. And we didn't, this might be quite hard to understand because there's no way in which a neem is going to grow that quickly. But we forensically understood that the neems had actually been there all along when the Bavlia had been there, and the neems had been suppressed by the Bavlia. So these were not young neems, they were old neems that had grown old and gnarly, but they'd basically been inhibited by the presence of the Bavlia. By 2010, we had a thriving suite of plants on the lake's edge. And then by 2010, you can see the neems really quite big on the left. Now, the interesting thing is that the minute you start looking at these later pictures on the right, you'll notice that the neems have died. And the neems have died essentially because the lake had expanded, and neem doesn't like to get its toes wet. So that was part of one of the casualties of actually doing the restoration, that some of the trees that had existed there and been inhibited now died with changing conditions. But you can see how you're beginning to get a habitat that's looking really quite respectable in 2014, but this is already now 8 years after we started doing it, right? And then just taking you through to 2019 when this last picture was taken, you can see how just by planting the right things at the right place, in the right soil, you could get very, very dramatic results, even in a stressed habitat where you have very little rainfall and very little soil that's coming in at this time. And, the whole question really is, these pictures as well, they look beautifully green. These are very early on, but these are all monsoon effulgences. This is all the monsoon doing its magic. Most of what you're seeing in the big picture on the left is cleome, which is a small ephemeral plant that comes up first when with the first rains, and then clears out within about 5 or 6 weeks of this area. So you can make the mistake of being hugely encouraged by the fact that these areas can look green very early. And one of the things that one tends to do when you're restoring a site is to think of water harvesting. I'm going to go on a little bit later to tell you why we thought this was wrong and it was not the right thing to do. But we decided that gully plugging, that all of this rainwater was running off the hills and either going into the lake or running off outside the park. And that we thought that it's really important for us to try and harvest the water and then use the water for these purposes. Obviously, starting our own nursery is hugely important. It's something that you pretty much have to do no matter where you are doing your restoration work in India, because plant nurseries don't tend to stock native plants in any depth, right? So the first, to start a nursery and start collecting seeds. I'm not going to dwell on this. But we found that we were getting something like 60 to 65% survival rates at the end of our first year of planting. So we decided that, look, we didn't know enough about what plants needed. The trouble with floras, and there is a flora of the desert. There's a gentleman called Dr. M.M. Bhandari who wrote the definitive book about the flora of the desert. So these floras exist. The floras are very poor in terms of giving you information about the local ecology and what the plants need. So we thought maybe we should take very careful notes about what we're planting, what depth we're planting in, what kind of soil we're giving the different pits, and then see whether any kind of patterns emerge. And we did this for 2.5 years by giving a number to every single pit, recording how deep each pit was, what species we were putting in, what the site quality was, and so on. And we began to see patterns. It took us by now we're 3 years into the project. We're still getting 60, 65, 70% survival rates. And it's only after we do this analysis that in most cases, but not in every case, we begin to see patterns that help us a great deal in terms of what to plant where, especially in terms of microsites. All right, now changing tack slightly, one of the things we discovered a little bit by accident was the presence of a particular grass that you see in this picture. And it's a grass that forms a kind of mat along with liverworts that you can see in the picture on the top left. And on the top right, you can see how there is a whole layer of soil above the rock that seems to be held in place by this grass. This grass is something called Oropitium tomeum. And we realized quite soon that the advantage of Oropitium was that you could actually lift mats by using a para or using a kurpi and taking some of these mats and putting them on top of rocks in order to basically grow things on tops of rocks. So the natural way in which rocks actually become colonized by plants in the desert is by Oropitium first starting to grow in these areas. There are amazing visuals that we've collected later to show how Oropitium actually works. Oropitium is such an important part of the ecological succession that you see in rocky parts of the desert. And we didn't know this at the time, but it's only sometime last year, I think, that a scientist from the IIT visited us and talked to us about biocrusts. And what we realized about biocrust was, what we understood about biocrust was that there's an entire community here of cyanobacteria and fungi and a whole lot of other microbiota that are actually active. So I've pinched this signboard that we've made for a school in Gwalior to explain how Oropitium works. But this gives you an idea of how something that we didn't understand at the time, we could see how Oropitium mats actually worked in the desert, but we didn't understand that it was actually an entire community of liverworts and mosses and fungi and lichens, right, that were actually doing this work. But we started, here's another little explanation of why biocrusts are so important and how, how they actually function, especially in arid places. In fact, there are now slogans that they use in the US like, don't bust the crust. So they don't allow people to actually walk freely in arid places because the crust tends to be so fragile. I'm going to cut here to Hathi Naher, which is a man-made canyon, if you like, or a canal. The picture on the top left shows you that it's like a gash. This is taken from the air. And the picture on the bottom left shows you how the canal snakes under the city wall and then heads towards the fort. And this was actually, the canal was hand dug by the ancestors of the Khandwalias that we employed 500 years ago when the fort was first built in order to channel rainwater into two lakes next to the bottom of the fort. The fort's drinking water actually came via this particular canal. And this canal, we decided, was going to be our first walking track for visitors. So the idea was these pictures now show you where the canal opens up, but it shows you the stone surface along which the water flows into the lake further on this side. Now, we decided to actually plant up this place quite carefully because this was going to be part of our yellow, what was called the yellow trail for visitors. And you can see how the Hathi Naher, or the gully as we call it, slowly started being planted up. The important thing here was that we were using Auropitium. So this was very, very early on, discovering Auropitium, excited by the fact that you've got this material that actually helps to colonize rock. And you can see the people placing mats of Auropitium as a means by which other plants can actually colonize the rock. So this worked really well, and you can see how the gully or the Hathi Canal actually became wonderfully colonized by plants within the space of about 4 years or 5 years. The picture on the bottom right is just to remind you what it was like when we first started. This is another set of pictures of that initial rock, which you might remember seeing when very, very early on, where we're beginning to look at cracks and trying to see whether we can actually restore this hill in a part of the park. And these pictures show you what it was like using your little cracks, using chasmophytes to actually grow in this area, and what happened over the course of the next 3 or 4 years just by exploiting the cracks in this particular rock. Now, I'm now coming to the present, just to give you a sense of what Rajodha Park looks like now. You can see that there's been an immense change. It's taken 14 years for this to happen, which may seem like a huge amount of time. But it does take that kind of time in the desert. You've got a growing season that lasts between 6 and 11 weeks, depending on the monsoon. So you've got a very, very short time in which plants are growing. These are some more pictures to show you. These pictures taken from the west of the fort show you, again, the picture on the top right shows you what the fort looked like and the land in front of the fort looked like, but it was still colonized by masses of Bavlia. And then 3 years later, when all the Bavlia had been cleared and we'd started planting, but they were barely visible in 2009. But 12 years later, 11 years later, this is what the park looks like now. And even in the dry, it's very easy to cheat with the picture by showing a monsoon picture, but everything looks green. But these are pictures of the dry season. So even when, even in March, when a lot of the grasses have dried and the ground flora has disappeared, this is what the park looks like. I'm now going to get into learnings. How are we doing with time? I think I have 15 minutes, right? I'm going to work my way through all these ideas. I may have more ideas than I can talk about in the time available to us, but I'm going to quickly try and talk to you about all these points. Now, obviously, when you're doing ecological restoration, you're aiming to repair an ecosystem that is damaged, right? And the language that people use when they talk about ecological restoration, which has become a big buzzword now, especially last year, I think, was the year of ecological restoration. Recovery and repair. These are the two key words that you use. Now, just to settle on each of these ideas very briefly. Soil. We didn't do any soil testing in the beginning. And one reason we didn't do any soil testing was that we didn't know exactly how to specify what parameters of soil need to be tested, looked at. This is something that was a huge lack, a huge missing piece of the puzzle when we first started out. So I just want to emphasize that soil is key. Soil is absolutely key. If you can learn how to specify what parameters to look at, and then learn how to actually read a soil report, you're well and truly on your way. So it's really important to do that. But the other point I want to make about soil is that a lot of people, when they find that they have a difficult soil or a recalcitrant soil, they imagine that it's possible to change your soil. In my experience, this is impossible to do. It's really impossible. No, really very, very hard. Maybe not impossible, but it's really hard to change the soil in a given site, unless your site is really, really tiny. But any kind of sizable site, it's very hard to get away from the soil that has actually taken place, that exists in that particular place. So you need to go with the flow, and you need to understand what your soil is like and what the microbiota of the soil. I mean, I imagine that 10 years from now, perhaps even sooner, we will look back on ourselves now and say, look how little we knew about mycorrhiza and about the small things that we're beginning to discover now. At the moment, we're very, very ignorant about that. Subsurface geology, I'm not going to spend time here. It's really all about minerals. There is lots of diversity of rocks, and all rocks are not the same. So a rock, for example, that is typically rich in, say, iron and silica is very different from a calcium-rich rock that doesn't have any iron in it at all. So you need to understand cations, you need to understand all these things. And my advice to anybody who's setting out to do any kind of work in this field is you need to really exert yourself to find a geologist who can hold you by the hand and lead you through this, because it's really, really very important. Now, moisture regime, obviously you need to understand your moisture regime, but it's not just about the quantum of rain that you get. It's about the seasonality of the rain. And I shouldn't need to remind you that your aim, always your aim when you're doing any kind of restoration work is zero irrigation. So you need to understand what is happening in your particular climate, in what your particular site. And I'll come back to irrigation later when we're talking about operations, but the moisture regime is absolutely key. Site history may sound as if, well, why are we looking at site history? But it's really about whether there is a land use that has happened on your land before that might have influenced either the chemistry of the soil or the life in the soil. Has it been an agricultural site, for example? Have they used fertilizers, chemical fertilizers? Have they used insecticides in your soil? All of this is relevant. So you have to know this. Landform is really, obviously, any kind of land that you use, unless it's absolutely flat, you need to understand the topography, you need to understand the contours, you need to understand how water flows off the land, because ultimately that is going to be completely important. I'm going to skip climate because that's obvious. Now, when we talk about reference sites, this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of doing any kind of restoration work. When you have a site that typically will be a degraded site, which is why you're doing any restoration at all. Your aim has to be to try and look for another site that is an analog, that is similar in terms of its soil, its climate, its moisture regime, in order to understand what kind of plants and what communities of plants are supported on that land. So even if it takes you weeks or months, it's really, really important to look for these analog or reference sites when you are starting out your work. Now, obviously, if the aim of your restoration is to try and is to try and restore land, you need to figure out what the causes of why it got degraded in the first place are. So I don't need to go into that. I mean, is it overgrazing? Is it about something else that has affected the land? Is it about pollution? Obviously you need to understand that in order to cure it. And what do I mean by site character? I have a slide that is slightly jokey in nature, but sometimes it's possible to use these binaries like this to characterize your site, and it's very useful in a way to come up with those characterizations, because then you have a conceptual way of thinking about your site. So is it threatened, or is it secure? Is it inhabited or empty? Is it forest or grassland, and so on? But this is said only slightly in jest. When it comes to your plant suite, obviously floras, there will tend to be floras, scientific floras about most places in India. Some floras are very, very old, some are much newer. BSI has tried to do a number of district floras. So floras are useful, but you have to remember that floras tend to be, they tend to be written, they tend to derive from dry specimens in herbaria. So very often floras will not be completely accurate. But the big problem with floras is that floras don't tend to give you any ecological information. They tend to be phylogenetic. They'll tell you about how plants belong to certain families and what families evolved first. But they're not really primarily interested in the ecology that is important to understand about a plant. So use floras by all means, knowing that there is this problem that you have to cure it. When I say clues, I'm really using clues to mean both clues from the past, such as the paintings that I showed you. Sometimes you'll get paintings that are actually very, very rich in the kind of information that they can give you, but also clues from the present. For me, clues from the present, for example, the Oropitium is a clue from the present. It's not something that anybody told us about. It's not something we learned by reading a book. It was just sheer empirical evidence that we came across and thought, wow, you've got this grass that seems to be able to hold a mat of soil together on which other plants are then able to grow. And it became such an important part of the way in which we treated our planting regime in this land. So look for clues, look for patterns, because they are, in many cases, they will not have been explored so far. What I mean by plant communities is related to the next one, which is plant density. I've seen a lot of restored sites or sites that are in the process of being restored, where people find it actually quite difficult to imagine what a site will look like once all the plants have grown up. And the result often is that you get such a dense amount of planting that it doesn't resemble anything in nature. So that's why reference sites tend to be so important, because reference sites give you a sense of, it tells you about plant communities, it tells you which plants belong together, and it tells you about plant density. There's a restored site near Delhi, for example, where your walking paths are walled off by such dense growth that you can't set foot in it, and it doesn't correspond to anything that you would expect to see in a dry, thorn habitat like Delhi. So pay lots of attention to the planting density that you're going to use. I'm not going to go on about monitoring. It's obviously really, truly important, that you set up a system of monitoring what you've done and making sure that you understand where you've gone wrong and where you need to make mid-course corrections. Native plant lists are also not something that requires me to say very much, except that it can be tricky to know what is native and what is not native, but this is a big subject for another day. Usually your floras will give you some hints about this, but it's clearly really important to have native plant lists that are very, very specific. For example, people will often say, but it's a neem. Neem is a native tree, but neem is not a native tree to the desert, right? So the fact that a plant is an Indian native doesn't mean that it qualifies to be a native in a particular place that it doesn't belong to. So you need to be very specific about how you apply the word native, because your objective is quite simply to find plants that are perfectly adapted to all the conditions that you have on your site. And if you don't find those plants, if you don't use the right plants, you're going to then have to either water them or give them nutrients, which is not what you want to do. Phenology is important because very often you will have things happening at certain times of the year that are interesting, beautiful, or relevant just purely from a point of view of survival. I found, for example, when I was writing my book on Central India, that almost all the trees that come into new leaf from about the end of March onwards all come out in red new leaves. This became endlessly fascinating to me. I'm not going to go there, but it's just that's an aspect of phenology. But if you can understand phenology, if you understand how phenology works on your site, it becomes very, very interesting. Not just trees. Both these rectangles are in a lighter form because these are more important. We tend to think of planting regimes as being only tree planting regimes. But none of these schemes, none of the big tree planting schemes, 2 million trees, 5 billion trees that the government has actually set out to do with trees qualify as ecological restoration. And there are many, many kinds of sites where trees are not at all relevant. The large parts of the sandy desert are a case in point. So it's really not just about trees. And you can actually have a very biodiverse field, even with microbiota, even with little things, even with things like lichen and mosses. And if you go up into the mountains, this is what you will actually find. So don't concentrate only on trees. My second last slide, I think, if anybody's panicking about time, is, okay, I'll go very quickly through this. Obviously, in your operations, you have to look at repair and protection. You have to look at basically whether you are setting out to do what's called natural or passive restoration depends on the state of the land that you are actually looking at. If you are looking at a place that is severely degraded, then it's not possible for you to merely protect land. But there are cases where protection is enough, where you can actually, where the potential is very high to achieve some kind of biodiversity. Invasives, I won't spend time on this. Bavli as a case in point, invasives have to be removed. There's a huge case recently where in Delhi, in the Delhi Central Ridge, the Forest Department has set out to try and restore the Central Ridge with leaving all the Vilayati kikar intact. This is clearly wrong. You have to get rid of invasives at all costs. Watering, I've talked about this already. It's very, very important for you to aim at zero irrigation. If you have to continue to irrigate your plants, then you're choosing the wrong plants. If you're continuing to need nutrients for your plants, then you're choosing the wrong plants. So your aim has to be to try and plant at a time when things would normally be germinating in nature. So you're typically planting at the start of the monsoon if you're working in a dry area. And by, let us say, December or so, you need to be weaning your plants off irrigation of all kinds. And this is what we do, Rajodha Park. We don't water anything at all inside the park. And if you can't do that, then you're doing something wrong. So that's when you need to make a mid-course correction. Now, microsite information, I'm going to skip for the moment. I'm just very aware that I'm overstepping my time. Starting a nursery, really, really important. Nurseries of native plants are only just starting up. I'm very privileged to be part of a very exciting group of people who hold hands across the country called the Ecological Restoration Alliance. We're all people who in our different ecologies work with restoration, do restoration work. And a lot of us are starting nurseries of native plants wherever we're working. So I can foresee a time not very far away from now when you'll actually have nurseries popping up in different parts of the country that actually represent large swathes of native plants. But at the moment, this is not true. So I have found over the last 15 years that wherever I start new work, the first thing you have to do is to start a nursery. And starting a nursery is not easy. You have to journal very carefully. You have to learn in many cases how to germinate things that can be recalcitrant and difficult, but it's a crucial part of actually doing of your operations. Soil in planters, we experimented with different kinds of soil mixes in planters when we started up. It's very important to use native soil, to use a high proportion of local soil when you're actually providing soil mixes for new plants going in. People often make the mistake of using much richer soil, and then plants struggle the minute their roots come out of their, the original kind of planter. So that's very important. Nutrients, well, there is now more and more talk of bionutrients and especially mycorrhizal propagules, which you can actually use even in your thales when you're actually propagating plants. This is a young science in India, but I think is likely to become more and more important. But any way that we actually can find of using mycorrhiza, because mycorrhiza are proving to be such an important ingredient and a way in which plant roots partner with fungal endosymbionts to actually make a forest or to make a grassland. I'm going to skip disturbance for now. And just to get into the last overarching considerations, stakeholders. Now, there are stakeholders of two kinds. Very often, if you're in my kind of situation, your stakeholders will tend to be people who actually own the land. We are not in a position in this country yet where the government or the forest department actually allows you to work on large-scale projects. So you will tend to be working, at least in this initial period, with chunks of land that belong to people. And it's really, really important that you carry your stakeholders along, so that they understand what it is that they can expect to see at the end of a certain kind of time period, and that you don't make the mistake of having stakeholders chucking you out after 5 years, saying, look, this is not what we wanted. So very important in that sense to use your owner stakeholder. But the other kind of stakeholder are people who might be living on the land that you're working on. Now, this typically happens when you are able to work on large forest tracts. And I'll come to that when I talk about people on the land, which is one of the points on the right. Timelines, I don't need to waste time on it. Obviously, it's really important to be realistic about your timelines. If you tell people who own your land that you're going to do things in half the time that it actually takes, obviously you're going to get into trouble in desert rock, in the Thar Desert. And we've tried very, very hard to bring in all 74. We haven't succeeded yet. We've got to about 65, 66. And we're still learning about how these grasses interact. Does one grass, does it behave like a bully and push out other grasses? What do these grasses need? What kind of soils do they like? How do they compete? How do they flinch if they're being bullied? So all of this is a huge field that we need to understand still. And as I said, you can actually have a biodiversity of microbiota just with lichens and bryophytes, mosses, things like that. So don't think of biodiversity simply in terms of trees. People on the land is key. A lot of degradation that happens especially to large chunks of forest land, happens as a result of anomalies of political economy. It happens because of injustice. And if you have people on the land, or if there are people on the land that you're restoring, it's crucial for you to actually involve them in decision making and for you to understand what it is that are their emphases when they're looking at land improvement. Interpretation is something that I won't go into now. We've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in trying to basically interpret Rajoda Park because it's a restoration site that is intended for visitors. We have trained naturalists, we have habitat boards, we have outdoor exhibits. So a lot of it is about welcoming people and getting them to understand what it is that we were doing. And design and aesthetics is a major, major part of that. And lastly, just to say that, look, obviously flexibility is important. We don't, if we were to try and write a manual of what to do, if you can't be flexible with it, you're not going to achieve anything. This is a picture of a small part of our visitor center, where apart from the neem tree that you can see bringing in its leaves from the top, everything is part of the natural native vegetation of the desert. And, I can't tell you what a delight it's been and how happy I am that I gave up filmmaking and took to writing about nature, writing about trees, and learning to read the book of nature. So I hope this is something that I hope all of you can do in one way or another. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Pradip.
Are you going to have questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for 2 questions, but before that, thank you so much for starting this seldom spoken and much needed conversation on restoration in arid lands in India. So we have time for 2 questions. I would strongly encourage students to ask those questions and if possible to keep them short.
Hi, thank you for the really interesting and inspiring talk. What I wanted to ask is that the project went on for more than a decade, and it must have been a task to raise funding for so long, continuously. So, how did you navigate it? And yeah, that's what I wanted.
So it was very clear to me at the end of the first 3 years that the trust said, look, the park is an adjunct of the fort. And the fort is a museum, basically. It's a museum that attracts huge numbers of visitors every year. I think at this moment, they get something like 1.5 million visitors a year. At the time that we started work, the figure was close to 1 million. But the trust that runs the fort, it's a charitable trust, and it's not about parking their profits. And they said that if we can put money into actually making the adjunct beautiful and visitable, then this is something we're willing to do. They were spending on average something in the region of between 30 and 40 lakhs a year on the park. Now, at this moment, we don't manage to offset those costs with our earnings. But because we sell plants, we sell native plants to people, and because we charge 100 rupees for people to visit the park, we actually recover something like 60% of the annual maintenance costs on the park. Yes, and you're completely right. A lot of people would quail at the idea of having to support a project for 14, 15 years in order to get these kinds of results. But it's actually possible to achieve these results much quicker in places that are not as difficult and arid as Jodhpur is.
All right, one last question. Over there.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you, we hear about how things are changing with the changing climate, how we hear about how Rajasthan is greening. And in this context, like, what does it mean to restore to a reference site? Like, do you actually see these changes happening on the ground, and do you account for it when you try to restore?
Yeah, it's really important. It's really important to understand that things are dynamic. Things are changing all the time. Even your reference sites are changing. It's for you to recognize patterns. But also remember that a lot of climate change happens very, very slowly. You know, you're talking about disruptions in terms of rainfall patterns or in terms of, rising, but these are very, very slow. A lot of these climate changes you tend to see in mountains, where you have elevational big differences in terms of temperature. But in the plains, it's not so clear. But you're absolutely right. It's important to be flexible. It's important to recognize the dynamism of nature and the way things change, and to adapt accordingly.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Pradip. Can all of you please join me in giving Pradip a round of applause?
Thank you.